Archaeology can sometimes be terrifying. Today I'm exploring discoveries that still haunt the scientists who made them. From victims of sacrifice with their hearts ripped out to the most brutal shipwreck disaster in human history. Cracking the case of King Tut's curse. When Howard Carter opened the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun in 1922, he was blinded by his lust for treasure. He had no idea the kind of plague he would unleash upon himself and the other archaeologists. In the years following the violation of the ancient king's final resting place, there was a string of mysterious deaths. To this day, it's believed Howard Carter unleashed the curse of the pharaohs. Now, after more than a century, scientists think they've solved the mystery. They may have pinpointed the cause of all the misery that followed the discovery of the tomb. But just what misery was there, really? Inscribed on tomb walls across the Valley of the Kings, there are warnings not to disturb the rest of the dead. In ancient hieroglyphics, the warnings are very straightforward, saying things like, "They that break this tomb shall meet death by a disease that no doctor can diagnose." Howard Carter was well aware of this before he breached the sealed tomb door. He knew about the warnings of malicious spirits and forbidden evils that would be unleashed. But being a man of science, Howard Carter wasn't afraid of a little old curse. Not until people started dying. Lord Carnarvon was Carter's patron, the man who funded the excavation in 1922. He was one of the first to walk into the rooms filled with the dead pharaoh's treasure. A few weeks later, he died from an uncertain diagnosis. It was thought he may have had blood poisoning and pneumonia, but doctors were befuddled. Just like the warning said, Lord Carnarvon died of a disease that no doctor could diagnose. Howard Carter also died of disease, though it took him a bit longer. His death wasn't until 1939. After a long and exhausting battle with Hodgkin's lymphoma, he passed away. Excavator Arthur Weigel died as well at the young age of 54 in 1934. It's believed he had cancer. 6 of the 26 people on the scene when the tomb was opened died within the first 10 years from a variety of random issues: malaria, diabetes, asphyxia, and exposure to X-rays. There were a lot of other spooky things that happened as well, adding to the possibility of a curse. National Geographic wrote that when the tomb was opened, Cairo was suddenly engulfed in a freak sandstorm, and the power across the city went out. During the excavation, Lord Carnarvon's dog let out a blood-chilling howl and fell over dead. It was as if a force beyond scientific understanding was trying to stop these men from breaching the tomb. Now scientists think they have an answer for the mystery. They can't explain the freak sandstorm or Lord Carnarvon's dog, but they do think they know what caused the bizarre deaths. Toxic levels of radiation may have led to the excavators falling into early graves. Ross Fellows wrote in the Journal of Scientific Exploration that the radiation level inside King Tut's tomb is so high that anyone who spends too much time inside could develop sickness and cancer. Wait a second? Radiation in an ancient tomb? How is that possible? That's the bonus mystery you get today, totally free of charge. Tut's tomb isn't the only one filled with radiation. Scientists have used a Geiger counter at various sites and confirmed many tombs to be radioactive. Ruins from the Old Kingdom, not just in the Valley of the Kings, show evidence of intense radiation. The radiation is presumed to be natural. Something in the earth caused radiation to seep outward, corrupting temples, pyramids, and tombs. That's the theory, but don't buy into the theory too quickly. Scientists can't actually pinpoint where the natural radiation came from. It's possible the source wasn't natural at all. What if the radiation came from some advanced form of technology scientists don't know about? It's possible the Egyptians were using uranium to power the very equipment used to build their tombs and other monuments, explaining the lingering radioactivity. Honestly, this is so crazy that I would like to hear your thoughts. Please tell me what you think about the Pharaoh's curse and Tut's radioactive tomb in the comments. Ripping out hearts. Archaeologists in Peru made a discovery so shocking I'm not even sure I should tell you about it. The remains of several dozen child sacrifice victims were unearthed, with more waiting to be discovered. But that's only the tip of the iceberg. The director of the excavations at Pampa La Cruz, where the remains were found, is Gabriel Preto. He's a professor of anthropology at the University of Florida and an expert in all things ancient Peru. According to Gabriel, there were 76 skeletons found. The skeletons show evidence that they had their hearts ripped out of them, like some crazy scene from a horror movie. To be more scientific and less gruesome, let me say it in a different way. All 76 skeletons showed evidence of a transversal clean cut across the sternum. This means that the ribcage was likely opened to extract the heart. Then the sacrifice victims were buried stretched out in the ground, their feet pointing to the east. Archaeologists did not see this coming. They knew sacrifices were a thing in the ancient Chimu culture at Pampa La Cruz, but the sheer number discovered was almost too much to bear. It brought the total number of child sacrifice victims found at the site to 323. Plus, at the nearby site of Las Llamas, another Chimu city, archaeologists have found 137 sacrifice victims, both children and adults. At Las Llamas, the sacrifice victims also had their hearts deftly removed. It's an unavoidable fact at this point. The Chimu culture of ancient Peru sacrificed kids and extracted their hearts, possibly to eat, as if it wasn't bad enough already without some light cannibalism thrown into the mix. The newly discovered skeletons appear to be from about 1100 AD, 400 years before the Inca Empire. This was when the Chimu hit their prime, with their city of Chan Chan one of the biggest and most important in the Americas. But why did they feel the need to engage in such brutal sacrifice rituals? They didn't just sacrifice people now and again, they did it all the time on a massive scale. Even Gabriel Prato said he doesn't know the answer. It may have been to sanctify agricultural systems. Human sacrifice could have become so ingrained in their society that the Chimu did it willy-nilly. Oh, a new school's being built. Child sacrifice. Not enough spring rain? Child sacrifice. Too much spring rain? Believe it or not, child sacrifice. And now for number 9, but first it's shout-out time. Big thank you to Darkness for your generous super thanks. Subscribe to join the Origins Explained family. European bloodsuckers. In 2022, an archaeological team came across the remains of something none of them had expected to see in their lifetimes. It was shocking, intriguing, and reminiscent of a particular blood-sucking count from Transylvania. The archaeologists came across a vampire, and it wasn't the only one. The team was excavating a cemetery in Poland when they found a woman lying in the dirt with a sickle laid across her neck. If you're not familiar with a sickle, it's the same instrument used by medieval farmers to harvest grain, and used by the Grim Reaper to harvest souls. The sickle had been placed over the woman's neck in such a way that if she had risen, it would have cut her head off. Whoever buried this woman was terrified she would be reanimated as a vampire and rise from her grave. They put the sickle there to keep her from sucking their blood in the dead of night. It's amazing that I'm saying all this, but it's 100% true. Starting around the 14th century, people in medieval Europe went nuts with vampire superstition. Matteo Barini, an anthropologist from Liverpool John Moores University, said the practice was strongest between the 14th and 17th centuries. However, the bizarre burial practices surrounding vampires likely started with the Romans in the 5th century. What do you think could have caused such hysteria? Vampiric outbreaks typically occurred at the same time epidemics swept across a local area. For example, if the plague came to a village and decimated the population, they thought a vampire had come into their midst. It started with the family. First one person grew ill and died, then other family members started dying, then the neighbors died, and then more people in the village. It was assumed the vampirism was spreading, the villagers being hunted one by one. However, it was most likely a contagious disease spreading from within the house, then to the neighbors, then to the rest of the village. But hey, what do I know? Maybe it was vampires and modern archaeologists don't know what they're talking about either. At another site in Poland in 2022, archaeologists discovered triangular padlocks clamped around the feet of young children. These children may have died from a plague, but the locals thought they were vampires. The padlocks were to keep them firmly in their graves. In Connecticut, archaeologists in the 1990s found a man who had died in the 1800s under very strange circumstances. His thigh bones were crossed over his chest, just underneath his skull, forming the skull and crossbone symbol you usually see on pirate ship flags. His name was John Barber, and he was an American vampire. Well, his family thought he was a vampire. Modern scientists say John Barber died from tuberculosis. His gray skin and bloody coughing likely made him seem like a demon to to his own family. Last but not least, Italian researchers in 2009 found a lady vampire with a brick jammed into her mouth. It's one of the most disturbing vampire burials ever found. She died in the 16th century, buried in a deviant graveyard in Venice. Somebody jammed a thick brick into her mouth so that if she rose from the dead, she wouldn't be able to bite anybody. I don't know about you, but if I came back to life as a vampire, I'm not sure a brick would stop me. Creepy burial rituals. Hunter-gatherers in ancient Brazil had a slightly different concept of death than people today. In prehistoric Brazil, you're not going to believe what people did to the cadavers of their dead loved ones. This gruesome tale takes us to Lapa do Santo, a cave in the middle of nowhere. Not quite the jungle, but pretty close. In 2001, scientists started excavating the interior of the cave. Now, after more than 20 years, researchers from Germany's Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology have announced their terrifying discoveries. You're going to hear words like decapitation, mutilation, cannibalism, and defleshing. This is your warning now, so if you continue, then don't blame me for what you're about to hear. About 12,700 years ago, a group of primitive humans who foraged and sometimes hunted arrived in Brazil's interior savanna. They made a home for themselves inside the Lapa do Santo cave. They relied primarily on vegetables, aquatic food, and small animals that were easy to catch. They didn't build any great monuments or cities. They didn't leave much behind except for some tools, things like spatulas and fishhooks. Inside the cave, more than 40 human burials have been discovered. The Stone Age culture didn't seem to mind living with their dead. The graves were strewn throughout the cave, right underneath where people slept and did domestic activities. For the first couple thousand years, things were fairly normal. Bodies were buried just as you would expect them to be, flat in a grave with little ceremony. Then, 9,400 years ago, something big happened. The cultural traditions changed dramatically. Instead of laying the dead to rest in peaceful graves, the cave inhabitants started disarticulating the deceased. By disarticulation, I mean the removal of limbs. Some people were dismembered shortly after death and buried without their arms and legs. Others were buried with only a few of their bones. Also, evidence from around this time shows people started burning the bodies. Bones from this period have also shown tooth marks, suggesting their friends and family were gnawing on them after they died. There is no indication of what happened to these people that made them suddenly become obsessed with dismemberment. People were buried in bizarre ways. For example, one person was buried with their hands amputated and placed on either side of their face. This was almost definitely part of a ritual, but where the idea came from is anybody's guess. Archaeologists had no idea the kinds of dark depths they would fall into while investigating the Lapa do Santo cave. What they found is evidence of a culture that seems to have spiraled into a horrific religion, a sort of cult that had them cannibalizing their friends and doing weird stuff with their corpses. Bog zombies in Northern Ireland. In Northern Ireland, scientists discovered a bog zombie. At least it's the closest thing that's ever going to be found to an actual bog zombie. It's a rotten human body pulled from a bog in the village of Balahi. The corpse appears to be about 2,000 or 2,500 years old, belonging to a male who was only a teenager at his time of death. The discovery was made when a local from the village noticed some human bones at the surface. The police got involved because it kind of looked like someone had been murdered. But it turned out the bones were ancient, dumped into the wetland environment in the days when Egypt was still ancient Egypt. This person wasn't just a skeleton. They looked like an extra from The Walking Dead. He still had some pieces of skin, his fingernails, his toenails, and what appeared to be a kidney. John Joe O'Boyle from Northern Ireland's Forest Service called it a very exciting find. Exciting is definitely one word for it. Another might be gruesome. As for the bog zombie himself, archaeologists haven't figured out anything about who he was. They think he was buried in a stand of trees, but then again, he may have just been dumped in the bog. Sort of like how the mafia used to dump people into Lake Mead stuffed into barrels. The terrifying demon prison. There is a giant hole in western Iran that some say holds the spirit of a demon. It's in the middle of the desert, a semi-natural formation that looks as if it leads straight into the depths of hell. Locals call it the Prison of Solomon. Let's talk about something less disturbing than demons and cannibalism for just a few seconds. This supposed prison is the result of a groundwater well creating a small pond many eons ago. Over thousands of years, lime and other minerals solidified around the pond to create a conical wall. From a distance, the prison of Solomon looks a lot like a small volcano. The spring eventually dried, leaving the prison empty. Here's a view from above, looking directly down into the pit. And here's what it looks like from far away. Both images are from Wikipedia. The prison of Solomon looks a lot more imposing until you're standing at the edge looking in at an empty hole. That's what science says, but what about local legend? It's believed King Solomon from the Old Testament jailed a real demon inside the hole 3,000 years ago. Then he sealed the hole by building a temple above it. Furious, the demon brooded in its prison, releasing toxic gas from its mouth. It was said anyone who entered the hole was instantly killed by Solomon's trapped demon. This sounds like a silly story, but there could be some truth to it. Around 830 BC, the Manaean kingdom built a temple on the hill. There was still some hydrothermal activity in the form of a sulfur hot spring. The hot spring was likely used for medical treatment. But if the sulfur was inhaled, it could have killed people. Zoroastrians used the hill as a sacred place starting around 500 AD, when Zoroastrianism was still more popular in Persia than any other religion. It may have even been the scene of sacrifices, but that's not confirmed. With the rise of Islam, the temple on the hill was abandoned. These days, there's no sign of any demon in the hole, but maybe nobody's looked hard enough. The Aztec dinner party. It's time to attend an Aztec cannibal dinner party. New research from Mexico has revealed that a convoy of Spaniards found themselves ritually sacrificed in 1520. Then they were eaten. The research has taken years, with scientists from the National Institute of Anthropology and History tirelessly excavating the ancient town of Tecoaque. You're not going to believe what the town's name means. In the Nahuatl language of the Aztecs, Tecoaque means the place where they ate them. Yeah, I think we're on the right track here. In 1520, the people of this town captured a convoy of 15 male Spaniards traveling with a party of 50 women and children. Let's not get started on why 15 men needed 50 women. That's a conversation for another day. There were also 45 African and indigenous foot soldiers and roughly 350 locals who had allied with the Spanish. Isn't it crazy to think that just 15 guys managed to corral such a huge force and such a huge harem of women? Still, they didn't get to keep their party together for long. All of them were captured and sacrificed over the space of several months. Lots of them were eaten as well. When news got back to the head honcho, the Big Cheese, Conquistador Hernán Cortés, he ordered Tecoaque to be destroyed. He sent his man Gonzalo de Sandoval to obliterate the town in the early part of 1521. Excavations in the ruins of the city show that the people knew the Spanish were going to strike back. Archaeologist Enrique Martinez Vargas said his team came across a pit that was full of bones. Some of the bones had been carved into gruesome trophies, a sick sort of celebratory whittling at the hands of the cannibals. Because they knew the Spanish were coming to seek revenge, the people of Tecoaque tossed away the evidence of their massacre. They also tried to build a defensive wall. They weren't just going to lay down and wait for the Spanish to come. They erected a primitive defensive system through the main artery of their town. For all their preparation, they were still destroyed. All along the main thoroughfare, archaeologists came across the bones of women and children. Judging by the positioning of the bones, the women had been protecting their young children from the Spanish as they were slain indiscriminately. No matter which way you look at it, the whole situation is tragic. The Aztec were in the wrong. They shouldn't have been eating anybody. They shouldn't have built a skull rack and filled it with the decapitated heads of Spanish men and women either. The Spanish were also in the wrong for such bloody revenge. Before they left, the Spanish burned the Aztec temples and decapitated their statues. The disturbing truth of ancient floor burials. Archaeologists in Turkey thought the human remains they found buried underneath the floors of ancient mud brick houses were related to one another. They were more wrong than they knew. 9,000 years ago on a marshy plain, the residents of Catalhoyuk buried their dead underneath their homes. It was just like the Lapa de Santo cave I told you about a few minutes ago, where the prehistoric Brazilians lived above their buried dead. The people of Catalhoyuk did something similar. Archaeologists started digging up human remains from underneath homes, just like this one here. Image credit, Jason Quinlan. I know it doesn't look like much of a house anymore, but this was where a group lived once upon a time, long before the Sumerians or Egyptians were even around. Scientists assumed the people buried under specific houses belonged to the same family. Then they conducted DNA analysis. It turns out the people buried under houses were not genetically related. There seems to be no rhyme or reason to how people were buried under these dusty mud floors. Marin Palaud, a physical anthropologist with the US military, said the discovery speaks to the social structure these strange people had. There were about 10,000 of them living in Catalhoyuk, growing crops and taking care of domesticated animals. It's one of the earliest cities, so old that most people in other parts of the world were still living in caves. When archaeologists first found the site in the 1950s and started digging, there were a lot of things that surprised them. They didn't see any streets. Each mud brick house slouched against the other. There were no doors. The inhabitants climbed into their individual homes using a ladder and a hole in the roof. Inside the houses, the people drew pictures on the walls, just like how Native Americans left petroglyphs on canyon walls. They also buried up to 30 people underneath the floor of each house. These houses weren't big, as you saw from the picture I showed you a second ago, yet they managed to fit 30 people underneath the floor. It would be like if you lived in a bachelor apartment with only one room and had more than 24 corpses stuffed into the walls. Do you think you would be able to sleep at night? For the people of Catalhoyuk, they slept just fine. Living with the dead was part of life. What archaeologists fail to understand is why certain people were buried under certain houses. Comparing ancient dental remains from more than 260 individuals has shown relatives weren't buried near one another. A mother might be buried 6 houses over from her son, suggesting people didn't live with strong family ties. If people weren't bound by family, what kept them together? What determined who shared a home? One possibility is that membership to a certain house was based on who had access to certain tools, hunting grounds, water sources, or agricultural lands. It could also be that the people of Catalhoyuk lived as one giant family, symbiotic with one another, like the Borg, the world's bloodiest shipwreck. Murder, mutiny, blood, and slavery. These are 4 words that describe the worst shipwreck in history. Off the west coast of Australia, the bottom of the sea is covered in shipwrecks. Many of them have terrifying stories attached to their ruined hulls. But none of the wrecks are more haunting than the Batavia. The Batavia was launched in 1628 as the flagship of the Dutch East India Company. Her maiden voyage was supposed to be a simple one. The Batavia was to sail to Batavia, the very place she was named after, in the Dutch East Indies. Today, Batavia is called Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia. The ship was to collect spices and return to Europe. What should have been a simple voyage turned into a nightmare of biblical proportions. The captain of the vessel was Francisco Pelzart, with Ariane Jacobs serving as his skipper. What the captain didn't realize was that the skipper had some diabolical tricks up his sleeve. Jacobs was planning a mutiny with several other crew members. They wanted to get rid of the captain, steal the ship, and then sell the gold and silver on board before they arrived in Batavia. Unfortunately for everybody, Jacobs wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer. He steered the ship off course, ramming it into the reefs of the Hutman Abrolhos Islands on June 4, 1629. 41 men drowned in the disaster, with only around 300 reaching safety on Beacon Island. It was already a disaster, but this was where the true horror began. The captain left in a small skiff to Batavia, leaving the ship Batavia stuck on the reef. Captain Pelzart was unaware that Jacobs and several other men had been planning a mutiny. He left one of the would-be mutineers in charge while he was gone to get help, a man named Hieronymus Cornelis. Hieronymus was a barbarian of the highest order. One of the first things he did was trick 20 men into searching for fresh water on some nearby islands, then abandoning them to starve to death and die. Over the next couple of weeks, Hieronymus orchestrated a massacre that even the Aztecs would have been a little disturbed by. Hieronymus and his mutineers killed 125 of the survivors, including all the children and infants. The women were left alive, but hardly spared. They were kept as slaves. Unbeknownst to Hieronymus, the 20 men he had abandoned to starve and die had indeed found fresh water and were still alive. The two groups started war with one another, with small skirmishes and battles unfolding until everything reached its peak in October 1629. This was 5 months after the captain left to get help. It was the final battle, the mutineer murderers against a few remaining survivors. In the midst of battle, the captain returned with the research vessel Sodom. Euronymous and his mutineers were suddenly outmanned. They became the first Europeans legally executed in Australia for their crimes against humanity. These days, the haunting wreckage of the Batavia remains at the bottom of the ocean. It was rediscovered by a lobster fisherman in the 1950s. Who stole all these skulls? One of the oldest tombs in Sweden doesn't have a single skull in it. It's weird, creepy, and probably left many archaeologists with bad dreams. In Taos, scientists from the University of Gothenburg uncovered a stone burial chamber known as a dolmen. They excavated it, uncovering the remains of 12 people. These people were buried around 3500 BC, with most of the site being typical for that era. There were lots of dolmens used in Europe as mausoleums. Everything was normal until one of the researchers went, "Hey, where are all the heads?" The experts are at a loss, unable to explain why the dolmen's burial chamber has no skulls in it. Maybe they were stolen. Maybe these people were the victims of a mass beheading event. Or maybe it was all part of a creepy early Neolithic ritual. To make matters more confusing, the skeletons show no evidence of violence. These people weren't in a fight. They don't appear to have been injured in battle. Their heads are just sort of not there. Archaeologist Carl Goran Sjögren said this is not what is normally seen in megalith graves. Stone burial chambers from 7,500 years ago typically have smaller bones missing, like random feet and hand bones. This one doesn't just have missing skulls, but it also has some bones that it shouldn't. Archaeologists also identified the skeletons of rodents, goats, frogs, and pigs inside the chamber. What in the world is going on here? When archaeologists decided to really pinpoint the age of this grave, they were able to date it to approximately 150 years before any other known dolmen in the region with similar features. That means this could be the oldest burial of its kind in Sweden, and also the weirdest. There is one gravesite with an uncanny connection to this one, only it's not in Sweden, it's in Slovakia. The burial is slightly older, but the skeletons were also found to be missing their skulls. Scientists investigating the Slovenian grave suggested everything from a death cult to a disease that somehow resulted in mass decapitations. Do you have any theories as to why all these heads are missing? The skull and a haunted pub. I hope you're not too sick of missing skulls, because I have one more story for you, but trust me, I think you'll like it. It involves a haunted pub and the theft of a very old human head. The pub in question is the Golden Fleece, located in the city of York. It has a gigantic golden sheep hanging out front and a sign that reads, "Most Haunted," in spooky letters. The inn is about 520 years old and supposedly boasts some impressive paranormal phenomena. Its owners and staff say the stories are true. There are at least 15 ghosts wandering around in the building. One of those ghosts is Alice Peckett, whose husband John was the mayor of York in the early 1700s. Another ghost is a British army soldier known only as One-Eyed Jack, who died at some point in the 16th century. There's also the spirit of a Canadian airman from World War II who never made it back home. Every now and again, the ghost of a Roman soldier shows up, but only in the cellars, which were supposedly built upon the ruins of a much older structure from when the Romans occupied Great Britain. Now let's get down to business. In the late 18th century, a woman named Elizabeth Johnson frequented the Golden Fleece. At least she did until she got caught using forged banknotes. It was a single £1 note, but that was all it took for Elizabeth to be charged with defrauding the Bank of England. As punishment for her crime, Elizabeth was sent to the gallows. After Elizabeth was executed, a replica of her skull was gifted to the Golden Fleece because she had been such a consistent patron. She was a forger and a fraud, but she was still a good patron. For the next few centuries, Elizabeth's skull remained in a wooden box with a thin glass window. Then at the beginning of January 2022, her skull was stolen. Who in their right mind steals the replica skull of a hanged woman from a haunted pub? Luckily, the skull was soon returned to its rightful owners. Elizabeth's head is back where it belongs. Which of these terrifying stories did you find the most disturbing? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching.
And if you want to see more like this, be sure to stick around for an older video that you might have missed.
The City of the Anunnaki. Archaeologists recently discovered an ancient metropolis over 200,000 years old in Africa. Some people think this metropolitan area was home to the legendary Anunnaki, the great celestial gods that came down from the heavens and gave human beings life. The Mesopotamians worshipped these beings as gods, yet nobody knows where they went. They just showed up on the planet, allowed the first great civilizations to worship them, and then they disappeared. At least that's the fun story, but in reality they were most likely gods that faded over time, like the gods on Mount Olympus. Researchers discovered this bizarre city in southern Africa, in a remote region with very few humans. Locals have known about the ruins for centuries, but they never thought much about them that we know of. They thought the old broken walls were just the remnants of ancient farms. But this area was covered in gold deposits, most of which have been taken over the past 500 years. Some believe the Anunnaki settled here specifically to mine gold and created human workers using advanced genetic technology. Of course, this is all speculation. There may be some small ruins here, leftovers from an unknown ancient civilization. But they've only been seen through satellite images in the past and are heavily eroded. Mainstream scientists haven't said a word about this discovery, which, if true, would push back the date of the first great city on Earth by over 190,000 years. The Gujian Blade. About 50 years ago, archaeologists discovered an unusual sword inside a Chinese tomb. This sword was over 2,000 years old, and it shocked archaeologists because it didn't have a single trace of rust. The blade looked perfect when they excavated it, and it even drew blood when an archaeologist pressed his finger against its edge. Somehow, this sword had not been affected by 2,000 years sealed underground. The craftsmanship was remarkable. The sword was covered in detailed markings, and it seemed too perfect for something crafted so long ago. It was so impressive that the government of China declared it a state treasure. And for the Chinese, this sword is now as famous as King Arthur's Excalibur. Archaeologists originally found the sword in 1965 while they were surveying the ruins of Jinan, the old capital of the Chu state. During the excavations, they came across 50 ancient tombs. They found over 2,000 artifacts, along with what came to be known as the Gujian sword. The sword was in a wooden box that had been placed next to a skeleton, untarnished, made from solid bronze, and still sheathed in the scabbard. It's a double-edged straight sword, one of the earliest types used in China, and according to the inscription on the sword, it belonged to the King of Yu. The big mystery is that archaeologists don't know which King of Yu owned the sword, and nobody knows how the sword remained so sharp while being stuck in a box for 2,000 years. Researchers believe it has something to do with the unique properties of the sword, but all these years later, nobody has replicated the technology used to make it or identify all of its specific properties. Anti-gravity jars. About 300 years ago in India, anti-gravity jars were created. These magical jars could be filled with water, flipped upside down, and no water would come out. 3 centuries ago, seeing the magic jar in action blew people's minds. They didn't realize what they were seeing was just science, and they thought they were seeing magic. You can see one of these jars at the Museum of Kanchipuram. It was made of clay, but it has no top opening to fill it up. The only way to fill the jar with water is to flip it over and then pour water through the 5 holes at the bottom. When you flip the jar back over, not a single drop of water leaks out from any of the holes. The only way to get the water out is by pouring it through the spout at the top. There aren't any moving parts inside the jar. Instead, an unknown genius figured out how to fit twin funnels and a 90-degree bent pipe inside the jar to make it seem like magic. We don't know who invented the jar, but we know where it first appeared, in a village called Karigiri. The potters here were so creative that they built over 100 varieties of magic jars, although there are only 12 left today, and they are all in museums. The Great Mechanism. One of the most mysterious things ever pulled out of the ocean has got to be the Antikythera mechanism, dubbed the world's first computer. Sponge divers found it near the Greek island of Antikythera back in 1901. The computer is about the size of a shoebox, a bizarre contraption made of gears and dials, and it almost looks like the insides of a giant clock. You may have heard about the world's first computer before, but what I'm about to tell you is brand new. Archaeologists believe they have finally figured out the time when this mechanism first started ticking, December 22nd, 178 BC. This was not an easy conclusion to make. Scientists have been struggling for 120 years to figure out who made the device, why they made it, and what they used it for. Recently, there has been a lot of speculation about ancient aliens and the mechanism being a lost component to one of their machines. But the mechanism had probably been used as a type of calendar. The machine could predict when the next eclipse would happen, it could determine when athletic games were to take place, and other things like that. Researchers with the Functional Reconstruction of Antikythera Mechanism project got the start date by looking at the earliest day that any calculation on the machine could be made. There was a solar eclipse on December 22nd that lasted over 12 minutes, and December 23rd is the winter solstice. It makes sense that the machine that predicted eclipses was activated on the same day as one. There's still a lot of mystery here. We don't know how the mechanism was made, who figured out the complicated math, or who was going to use it. Martians in Japan. If you haven't heard the theory that a cataclysmic event happened on Mars hundreds of years ago and forced all the inhabitants to settle on Earth, now you have. It's completely outrageous. There is no evidence to support that a war on the Martian surface forced everyone to move one planet over, but some people are convinced. To help back up this bizarre theory, a connection has been made between a rock formation on the Red Planet and a historical structure in Japan. The Japanese made the Kofun tomb look like a giant keyhole. It is an immense burial mound still holding the remains of a long-dead Japanese emperor. The tomb is so big that it's still one of the largest monuments ever built, measuring over 1,500 feet long. A similar structure was found on the Martian surface using satellite images. It's dusty and red, yet it looks just like the keyhole burial mound in the Osaka prefecture of Japan. There is no denying the distinct keyhole shape is nearly the same. Conspiracy theorists argue that the one on Mars could be the remnants of an ancient burial mound, proving that humans might have lived on Mars. Or it could just be a coincidence, and the keyhole-shaped structure on Mars could just be a normal rock formation. Crusader hand grenades. Archaeologists have discovered ancient ceramic pots in Jerusalem. Scientists say the Crusaders used these strange pots, which were made in the 11th and 12th centuries, as hand grenades. This would make them some of the first hand-thrown explosives in the world. But scientists aren't 100% sure yet. They know these ceramic pots were used for all kinds of different things. Ancient people used them to hold mercury, as containers for oil, and just to drink out of. But new research by the Griffith University in Queensland has shown that at least one vessel contained potentially explosive material. The other 3 shards they looked at contained traces of oils and medicines. The 4th one had traces of sulfur, magnesium, and mercury. It could very well be that the Crusaders had figured out how to turn black powder into a devastating aerial bomb. Black powder was invented in ancient China and brought to the Middle East and Europe in the 13th century, right around the time Europeans made these pots. Mysterious stone discs. A team of researchers found over a dozen mysterious carved discs in Russia near Volgograd. This happened back in 2015 and was immediately controversial. The research team claimed that the strange discs they found contained a high-density metal called tungsten, something found mostly in military technology. And while the origin and nature of these strange stone discs remain a mystery, many believe they could be chunks of debris from an ancient spaceship. Though the team had discovered over 12 disc-shaped rocks earlier, they recently found a much larger one. One researcher, Vadim Chernobrov, told a Russian news agency, "We already found a dozen of these discs of not more than 3 feet in diameter, and in Kuzbas a disc of about 6.5 feet in diameter. The issue is the tungsten. It shouldn't be in an ordinary rock, never mind in 12 random discs of stone buried in the Russian wilderness." UFO junkies were quick to connect the stones to extraterrestrial technology. but the stones are probably just the result of erosion. This kind of thing can happen over millions of years, which is why you can find perfectly circular rocks on just about every beach in the world. These stone discs are strange, and their chemical composition is questionable. But for now, there is no more information to go on. Skinwalker Ranch. If there's one strange place in the US where scientists are stumped, it's Skinwalker Ranch. The property, which is 512 acres in northeast Utah, was home to an explosion of UFO sightings in the 1960s and 70s. Then, going on into the 1990s, stories came out about cattle mutilations and more alien sightings. It's also a paranormal hotspot, with a high concentration of both UFO sightings, electromagnetic anomalies, and unexplained happenings. Brandon Fugal, a real estate mogul, purchased the property in 2016 to conduct scientific research. He wanted to see if the ranch was as spooky as everyone said. He was hoping to look at things from a more scientific perspective, seeing if he could pinpoint the source of all the strangeness, whether it be a thin wall between planes of existence or just something in the soil. Fugal said that he acquired the property from billionaire Robert Bigelow for the purpose of conducting scientific research to determine if there was any validity to the extraordinary claims of paranormal activity. He said, although I acquired the ranch as a skeptic, I eventually had my own undeniable close encounter, a UFO sighting in broad daylight with multiple witnesses. But so far, nobody has come up with anything. Skinwalker Ranch is an anomaly, where people see spirits and aliens, but nobody knows why. The Hanging Pillar. At the 16th century Lepashki temple in India, there is something rather unusual. The Indian temple features stunning sculptures of gods and goddesses, beautiful reliefs of dancers and musicians, and countless paintings plastered over the walls. Its columns are huge, showcasing some of the most impressive architecture in the country. There is a large fresco of Virabhadra, which is the biggest fresco of an ancient god in the country. There is even a giant bull at the front of the temple carved from a single block of stone, supposedly the biggest in the world. But the incredible engineering goes one step further with a wonder that nobody can quite figure out. 70 stone pillars are supporting the ceiling, but one of them isn't touching the ground. It's floating above the surface, only about half an inch, but it's enough to pass pieces of paper, scraps of cloth, and other things directly underneath it. The pillar is simply floating, attached to the ceiling and not even touching the ground. We don't know how this is happening or exactly why the column ended up like that. Locals say it happened when a British engineer tried to remove the pillar as part of an attempt to uncover the secret of how the temple was built. But he failed, the column was dislodged, and now it floats. What's your theory? Let me know in the comments below. The Ica Stones. The Ica stones may or may not be real. They can be traced back to Dr. Javier Cabrera Darquea, who was given a mysterious stone tablet by a Peruvian farmer. The stone showed a strange fish, one that appeared to exist long before humans ever roamed the earth. It was the doctor's impression that either aliens had given humans the insider info about the extinct fish, or the timeline of human evolution and mass extinctions were wrong. This was an intriguing idea, and so Cabrera went searching for more of these mysterious stones. He found a cave loaded with them, over 100,000 stones with unbelievable engravings, yet he told no one where this cave was, preventing thieves from taking the stones for themselves. As he found more and more of these stones, the pictures on them got even crazier. Some stones were carved with modern surgeries, flying machines, humans riding dinosaurs, and astronomical knowledge that only 20th century humans have. It was at this point that people realized Cabrera was nuts. The original farmer who gave the first stone to Cabrera admitted he had carved it himself. No scientific studies have ever been done to prove the Ica stones are genuine, and after Cabrera died in 2001, there was nobody left to say the stones were authentic. Most scientists agree they were part of an elaborate hoax to get more tourists into the region. Did it work? The mystery of the keyhole. Scientists can't seem to figure out why ancient societies all over the world had a fascination with monuments in the shape of a keyhole. Civilizations that lived thousands of miles apart and at vastly different times in history all had an obsession with keyholes. For example, the Well of Santa Cristina in Italy was built as a sacred site by the Nuragic civilization, sometime around the 12th century BC. It was crafted by remarkably skilled masons who had advanced knowledge of stoneworking. Sadly, nobody left behind any written records of what the keyhole-shaped well was used for. Archaeologists believe it had something to do with secret meetings and cultic rituals. There was a larger site around the well, although the well itself was the focal point of the shrine. It could have been a cult dedicated to fertility or some kind of water god. In Saudi Arabia, researchers recently found ancient tombs that are also quite old and a long way from Italy. Researchers with the University of Western Australia surveyed the hundreds of key-shaped tombs from a helicopter, shocked to see they make up a kind of highway of the dead through the desert. In Japan, there are the keyhole tombs, undoubtedly the most mysterious. In Osaka alone, there are over 44 burial mounds, each shaped like a keyhole. They are truly massive, built between the 3rd century and 6th century AD. People of great social status were buried inside these megalithic keyhole tombs, including Emperor Nintoku. But still, we don't know why the keyhole shape was so important. According to Mr. Kurahashi, curator of the Sakai Museum, the shape is a symbol of power and authority. Somehow civilizations from around the world all came up with the same shape to represent something important. Now that's a very interesting coincidence. The Shugborough inscription. The Shugborough inscription has been baffling scientists for years. It can be found on the grounds of Shugborough Hall in England, an inscription left on the Shepherd's Monument from the 18th century. There is an engraving of Nicholas Poussin's Arcadian shepherds put up around 1748, and below it was a mysterious sequence of letters, OUOSVAVV. There is no explanation, no meaning, and the best code crackers in the world have never been able to figure out what the inscription says. This was a pretty big mystery even in the 19th century. Some of the most famous minds of the age, like Charles Darwin and Charles Dickens, tried to solve the riddle and couldn't. The only person who has even come close is Keith Massey, a linguistics expert who was once recruited by America's National Security Agency. He used his expert knowledge of Latin to fill in the blanks, translating the code into English to, "I pray that all may follow the way of true life." This was something like a prayer that could have been written on Christian tombs. While that does wrap things up nicely, not everyone believes it. One of the more outlandish theories is that the letters are a hint as to the whereabouts of the Holy Grail. Some say it was a surviving member of the Knights Templar who carved the letters into the stone as a final clue as to where the Grail can be found, if it ever existed at all. The Taos hum. The city of Taos in New Mexico is a quiet community famous for skiing and mostly populated by artists and creative people looking for a laid-back lifestyle. Have you ever been there? Taos is also famous thanks to a strange phenomenon that scientists have never been able to solve. It's called the Taos hum, and it just might drive you insane. The hum is what it sounds like. It was first reported in the 1990s by the residents of the town who described it mainly as a low, droning hum that could be heard no matter where they went within the village limits. Some believe the hum is natural, some say it's a psychological issue with the people who can hear it, and some believe there is an underground base of aliens conducting experiments in mind control. The first man to study the hum was Joe Mullins, a professor at the University of New Mexico. He surveyed the residents of the town and found that about 2% could hear the hum. So Joe set up equipment in these people's homes to see if it could pick up what they were hearing with their ears. His equipment picked up nothing. The only thing Joe found out was that each person described the hum slightly differently, as a whir, a buzz, or a literal hum. This puzzled researchers because clearly people were hearing something, but they were all hearing something slightly different. To this day, science has never been able to explain the hum, although similar situations have been reported in Borneo, Canada, and England. Do you think people are actually hearing something? Or is it all in their heads? The Brazil tablet. The Brazil tablet was supposedly brought across the Atlantic Ocean in 1310 by Malian explorers. This mysterious statue was left by the African explorers deep in the Brazilian jungle, then eventually picked up by the English explorer Percy Fawcett many centuries later. The tablet was described as having African pigment and features, clearly not made by any South American civilization, and yet picked out of an unexplored region in Brazil near the Culuan River. The figure on the tablet is dressed in the fashion of a sailor from the Mali Empire in Africa, probably meant to represent a Malian royal traveling across the ocean on a boat. The tablet implies that African explorers reached the New World far before European explorers. Some say the Mali Empire not only reached South America, but also arrived in North America and built a settlement in the Four Corners area. The presence of the tablet in the jungle suggests they had been exploring when the artifact was lost. However, there isn't much more evidence to talk about. We don't even know where the famous Brazil tablet went after Percy Fawcett found it. It's nowhere to be seen today. Plus, there are no archaeological remains of Malian settlements in the West. They definitely could have made their boats and come across the ocean hundreds of years before Christopher Columbus. But if it's true, the information has either been obliterated from the history books or the evidence has simply gotten lost. What do you think happened to the tablet? Tell me what you think in the comments. The Hanging Gardens of Nineveh. For centuries, archaeologists and historians have struggled to discover the truth behind the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Just like the Great Pyramids of Giza in Egypt, the Hanging Gardens were supposed to be one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But unlike the others, the gardens have never been physically found. Their ruins have never been uncovered where they supposedly should be in the old city of Babylon. But here's the thing. Dr. Stephanie Daly of Oxford University says the gardens weren't located in the city of Babylon, but 300 miles away in the city of Nineveh. Stephanie also claims the gardens weren't constructed by the famous Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, but by the Assyrian king Sennacherib. Stephanie put forth the theory in 1992 and then spent 20 years piecing it together. Her main piece of evidence comes from a bas-relief found in a palace in Nineveh, showing trees growing from a great colonnade in the palace. Plus, the city of Nineveh was also known as New Babylon, once the Assyrians conquered normal Babylon in 689 AD. The whole thing could just be a confusion between the two names. The whole point, though, is that scientists still don't know if the Hanging Gardens of Babylon ever existed, or where they were if they were ever real. Big thank you to Tactical Rhino and Andrew Jackson. Thanks so much for watching and supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, welcome, and be sure to subscribe to join the Origins Explained family. The London Stone. The London Stone has been identified as a Druid altar, a Roman milestone, and has been standing in London since prehistoric monsters roamed the land. In truth, this mysterious rock is a chunk of limestone seated in a glass case in the Museum of London. Previously, it had been in the iron grille of an office building from the 1960s with a bronze plaque saying its origin is a mystery. And yeah, that's true. There are so many myths surrounding the London Stone that it's hard to talk about all of them. Some say it was used by medieval kings and queens in ceremonies when they took control of London. Another myth is that if the London Stone is ever moved or destroyed, the city of London itself will crumble and die. The bizarre reality is that nobody knows where the London Stone came from or why it's so important. It's just kind of there, and always seems to have been. Some believe it's the magical heart of London when it doesn't appear to be anything more than a brick of limestone. Why do you think the London Stone is such a mystery? Let me know your ideas in the comments below. Proof of Atlantis. Depending on who you ask, Atlantis is about as real as Wakanda. Historians generally agree Atlantis is a fantasy world created 2,000 years ago by Plato, the Greek philosopher with a very active imagination. And yet people are still searching for Atlantis as we speak. One of these teams of researchers recently claimed that they discovered the exact location of the lost city, but not where you might expect. This group of amateur archaeologists is called Turanga Seta, and they are pretty hardcore about finding Atlantis. They believe the city is submerged 200 miles from the southern coast of Java in Indonesia. They arrived at this conclusion by looking at codes left behind by the ancient Javanese. They looked at geological abnormalities, traditional stories, and anecdotal evidence to come to their conclusion. This isn't all that scientific, and they haven't found any ruins, but they are confident Atlantis is down there. And if it's not, maybe it's somewhere nearby, waiting to be found on the ocean floor. Do you think Atlantis is real or just a myth? Jesus, the shapeshifter. In 2013, people started buzzing about a newly deciphered Egyptian text from 1,200 years ago. The text described Jesus as being a shapeshifter. Yes, it seems the ancient Egyptians believed Jesus had the uncanny ability to change his shape. But perhaps what's even stranger than what was written in the old text is that all information about the study vanished after the initial headlines. The story began to cycle through major news websites, then it was gone, and the study was seemingly abandoned. It seems like nobody wants to hear about how Jesus may have been shifting his shape, or what the mysterious Egyptian text is talking about. The text that was found was written in the ancient Coptic language by a distinguished theologian named Saint Cyril of Jerusalem in the 4th century AD. He tells the story of the crucifixion with one major plot twist. He says that Judas's famous kiss following his betrayal of Jesus was actually to make sure it was Jesus, because he was known for changing shape, shifting skin tone, and morphing between a young child and an old man. It's quite a curious situation. The text is one out of 55 manuscripts discovered in 1910 in the ruins of the destroyed monastery of Archangel Michael in Egypt. The manuscript had been buried for about 1,000 years by monks who had stashed them in an underground stone vault. This is all very strange. What do you think? Aztlan. Aztlan is the mythical home of the Aztecs, supposedly the land of the most ancient Mesoamerican civilization in human history, known as the Mexica. According to the Aztec legends, the Mexica left their home in Aztlan to find a new one in the Valley of Mexico, in the area around modern Mexico City. Aztlan was supposed to be a luxurious place situated beside a large lake, where all were immortal and the resources were abundant. When they left this land, the Mexica found themselves in a terrible hell of thistle bushes, horrible weeds, poisonous lizards, deadly snakes, and suffocating heat. Then they made it to the Valley of Mexico and built their new city, later becoming the Aztec civilization. What scientists don't know is whether Aztlan was a real place or not, but what we do know is that there was a major migration of humans moving from northern Mexico and the southern United States starting around 1100. This migration had the native people moving through harsh scrublands filled with poisonous creatures and brutal temperatures. They eventually settled in the region around Mexico City. This much of the story is true. The biggest issue is trying to figure out where in the world Aztlan might have been. It must have been somewhere in the United States, somewhere with moderate temperatures, crystal lakes, and rich resources. But just like Atlantis, we still aren't sure if Aztlan was even real. Taming a prehistoric giraffe. The Civatherium is an extinct genus of giraffeids, or in plain English, it was a type of giant primordial giraffe that used to roam across India and Africa. It was one of the biggest land animals in history, looking like an okapi but standing over 10 feet tall. Most scientists agree that the giant giraffe began going extinct 7 million years ago in the late Miocene period, then was completely gone by just 1 million years ago. But there is a bit of a discrepancy. In the ancient kingdom of Kish in Iraq, there was an enormous animal that looked an awful lot like a Civatherium that was tamed and ridden by humans. At least that's what the archaeological evidence shows us. Archaeologists have found rock paintings in the Sahara of gigantic giraffes, painted 8,000 years ago. During an excavation in Kish in the 1920s, an elaborate copper rain ring that was fixed to a chariot was discovered from 3500 BC. It was shaped just like a Civatherium. It was incredible because most rain rings depict things like horses and ordinary camels, but this one was unique, showing an enormous beast that couldn't possibly have existed back then. Or could it? This is what scientists can't figure out. We know that Sumerians tamed all kinds of wild animals, even allegedly taming deer to pull their chariots, but they also seem to have tamed wild, massive giraffes. As unlikely as this, there is a sliver of a chance that some of these beasts, just a few, survived until around 5,500 years ago, and that the Sumerians rode around on them like gigantic horses. Do you think the ancient Sumerians roamed around on gigantic giraffes? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and thanks for watching! Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you soon! Bye!